In this video, we'll look at some of the politics of the second political party system from the end of the Jackson's presidency to the early 1850s, the period when the country was growing westward. Jackson had left office in 1836, and his successor was Martin Van Buren. But if you recall Jackson's presidency, he had issued the Specie Circular, and that had led to an economic panic, and the Panic of 1837. And this recession kind of bothered Martin Van Buren's presidency. It was a troubled presidency from 1837 to all the way to 1841. In the 1840 election, the Whigs nominated former war hero William Henry Harrison, who had fought the Indians under Tecumseh in the Ohio Territory. If you recall, he had won the 1811 Battle of Tippecanoe. As you might recall, the Whigs tended to be a little bit stronger in the North, and to show that their party was not just from the northern states, the Whigs nominated the Virginian John Tyler as Harrison's vice presidential candidate. And their famous campaign slogan was, quote, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too." And you can see that on the right. In the 1840 election, the Whigs tried to deflect Democratic attacks that they were aristocratic. Remember, Jackson was seen as a man of the populist. Both candidates in 1840 ended up arguing that no, they were born in log cabins and they weren't eating off of silver plates or anything. And, people have spoken of the 1840 election as a result as the log cabin campaign. In the 1840 election results, Harrison won in a landslide. Believing that the Whigs had successfully defended against charges that they were for the elites, the Democrats bemoaned that they had been, quote, out-Jacksoned. The 1840 election was the first transfer of power in the second political party system. But the Harrison presidency was really kind of not to be. It was short-lived. In his long inauguration, it was very cold, bitterly cold, and he had greeted people after the ceremony bareheaded for a long time in the cold weather, and he ended up contracting pneumonia. He died only 1 month after becoming president. Thus, his term in office is the shortest in American history. It was also the first time in history a president had died while in office. John Tyler thus became president, and Tyler ended up serving through 1844. By the late 1830s and early 1840s, enough Americans had flooded into the Mexican territory of Tejas that they declared themselves an independent Republic of Texas. This story is covered in more detail in a subsequent video, but it's unfolding in the presidencies of Van Buren and Harrison, Tyler, and the next president, James K. Polk. Anyway, another controversial issue in the Tyler presidency was relations with Great Britain. Fighting broke out over the northern boundary of Maine. Where was it? But that was ultimately settled with a compromise in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. You can see it here. This treaty also reaffirmed the earlier Convention of 1818, which had placed the Canadian-U.S. boundary extending westward from the Great Lakes to the Rockies at the 49th parallel. John Tyler was from Virginia, and while he was the Whig vice president under Harrison, once Harrison was gone, Tyler didn't adequately support the Whigs' economic agenda, the American system, well enough to please many stalwart Whigs. And so in 1848, the Whigs sort of abandoned John Tyler and named Henry Clay their nominee. The Democrats, meanwhile, nominated James K. Polk, and you can see him on the left and Clay on the right. And in the end, Polk won the election and was president through 1848. Now, about this time, Americans were flooding westward, both into the Mexican territories of the Southwest and into the disputed Oregon Territory, the land in the Pacific Northwest beyond the Rockies, claimed by both U.S. and Britain. Polk in the 1844 election won by arguing for the admission of Texas as a state and a hard stance on both the Southwest Mexican territories and the Northwest Oregon Territory. When the United States under Polk admitted Texas as a state in 1845, the Mexican-American War broke out. The Mexican-American War, I should note, is covered in more detail in a subsequent video. As the Mexican-American War broke out, Anglo white settlers in the Mexican territory on the Pacific coast rebelled. Clearly taking a cue from Texas, John C. Fremont, shown on the left here, briefly seized the area around the city of San Francisco. Hoping that the U.S. would intervene, he declared the so-called California Republic, which is often called the Bear Flag Republic because of its flag showing a bear. The question of Oregon Territory quickly grew into a contentious issue for Americans during the Polk administration. The Webster-Ashburn Treaty of 1842 had reaffirmed the earlier Convention of 1818, and what that had done is those two had extended the Canadian-American boundary westward from the Great Lakes all the way to the Rocky Mountains. It went along the 49th parallel all the way to the Rocky Mountains. But it left the question of west of the Rocky Mountains open. The territory of Oregon was open. So the Americans, they were pushing a hard line. They wanted the boundary north of the 49th parallel west of the Rockies at 5440, while the British were pushing for a line southward at the 42nd parallel. And you can see all three lines here. The Americans were declaring 5440 or fight, and it once again made it seem like the United States and Great Britain might be headed towards war. Thankfully, however, calmer heads prevailed and a compromise was reached. The compromise was pretty obvious, I think. The two nations just agreed to extending the 49th parallel westward over the Rockies to the Pacific coast. The British did get the Americans to grant them all of Vancouver Island, even though the southern part of the island was below the 49th parallel. The British feared that they'd have less access from the sea otherwise. In 1848, right before Zachary Taylor's election, and after the Mexican-American War won for the United States all of the Southwest, again, that will be discussed in a subsequent video, and by the way, that West included California. Gold was discovered in California at a sawmill near Sutter's Fort. And it wasn't a solid chain of gold, but occasionally narrow veins exposed by weathering. Specks of gold and the rare nugget, that's a speck compacted by tumbling of water, could wash into the rivers where they could be easily accessible. Suddenly, everybody wanted to go to California. Thousands of people poured into it. By 1849, there were 80,000 new arrivals in California, and they were all races: European, Mexicans, Australians, Chinese, American. Before, California had only 20,000 inhabitants total. Most came by ship, but some took the overland trail. Here you can see a flyer. What you do is you take a steamship down to the Central America, Nicaragua, cross overland to another steamship on the west coast, and then come up to California that way. Of course, all the people pouring into California in 1849 is the reason that the NFL football team of San Francisco is known as the San Francisco 49ers. I just said that a lot of different ethnicities flooded into California, including the Chinese. The Chinese were able to come because China had just been opened up, and the clipper ships made the journey across the Pacific reasonable. And here you can see a picture of Chinese prospectors. The Chinese immigrants would face an incredible amount of discrimination. The first prospectors simply panned in the streams or built crude wooden troughs through which a running stream was diverted, and this trough would have a mesh that would catch the larger chunks of gold. You do see a lot of people pouring in, and by the way, this was where Levi Strauss, who saw all these people pouring in San Francisco, started a clothing company with denim pants that wouldn't rip as easy for all these prospectors. Of course, Levi Strauss and Levi's are known today. By the 1850s, it was becoming increasingly difficult to find gold. It wasn't as easy, but the miners had developed more advanced ways. They developed hydraulic mining, which used high pressure water jets, and that could help erode some of the hillsides. You are going to see a lot of this going in, a lot of this silt going into the Sacramento River. And that's going to cause problems for Sutter's Fort in the city of Sacramento. As all of this was unfolding, in the 1848 election, Polk honored his promise not to seek a second term, and the Whigs nominated Zachary Taylor. Now, he was just made a hero of himself in the Mexican-American War, and people weren't quite sure of where his partisan allegiances lay. But in the 1848 election, he defeated the Democratic candidate Lewis Cass. 2 years into his presidency, Taylor died of a stomach ailment. He had been attending an event at the Washington Monument, which construction had just begun. By the way, that construction would be halted all the way into the 1870s because of lack of funds. But Taylor was attending an event there, and I don't know if he ate something, but he ended up dying of what they thought was cholera, but it just could have been any stomach disorder. But when he died, his vice president, Millard Fillmore, became president. And Fillmore was a former New York congressman. And during all of this, by 1850, the question of how to admit new states in the West had grown even more contentious over the issue of slavery. Just before Taylor died, enough people had flooded into California that it had applied to be a state. With the question of statehood for California and the growth of the other Western territories' statehood sure to follow, the questions of the expansion of slavery ensured that the decade of the 1850s would be dominated by slavery and westward expansion. Ultimately, it broke up the second political party system, but that is a story for a later video. In any event, this concludes the video on the politics of Manifest Destiny from the late 1830s until early 1850s.